Hello my dears, welcome to the next video in the world of my thesis. This was honestly one of the most interesting and also infuriating things to research thus far, I think. I had an inkling that our grading system was a disaster, right? Like, I think that we all know that. But I didn't know the specifics of it, and I learned so much. But before we get into that, let's talk about who I am, why we're here, why I'm qualified to be talking about this. So, hi there, hello. My name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I am in the midst of a thesis into accessible education and disability theater, culminating in the world's first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And I am documenting all of that process on my channel so that all of these resources are freely available to anyone who may want or need them. If you want to follow my show on social media, which you definitely should because my team is incredible and they're doing some great posts and it's so cute and good, yes, I have linked all of that info in our description. You can learn more about all these things there. I've also linked the playlists to the other videos on my accessible classrooms and disability theater if those interest you as well. And on top of that, I have also taught on and off for about 6 or 7 years, and I am openly queer, trans, autistic, and disabled, and also I'm still struggling in school right now. It's still terrible. Yeah, it's a whole experience. What I'm trying to say is, yes, I am qualified to be talking about these things, almost too qualified, please help me. I am also a white person in their early 20s with shoulder-length light brown curly hair, and I am wearing a burnt orange button-up shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. Super glad to have you here. If you want to like, comment, subscribe, send a super thanks, all those options are very open to you, but no pressure. Let's talk about grading. Now, I usually try to make my videos a conglomeration of several textbooks that I've read. Today is mostly just a breakdown of one book. Is it right here? It is, haha! This book is called Grading for Equity, and it is by Joe Feldman. It is truly an incredible read. It walks you through a lot of things that I'm gonna sort of gloss over in this video so that it's short-ish. It's not gonna be short, so it's less of a marathon. Definitely in my list of top 5 books that I would like to hand deliver to every teacher I've ever met. The rest of that list being Mad at School by Margaret Price, Studying Disability, Arts and Culture by Petra Kuppers, and if you teach theater, The Frantic Assembly Book of Devising Theater by Scott Graham and Stephen Hodgett is really great. Definitely all those books are worth your time, but also, let's be honest, educators don't have enough time, energy, money, or support to sit down and read textbooks on how to educate for fun, so that's why I'm here. Am I having fun? Very occasionally, but mostly no. General outline so you know what to expect. We are going to talk about the impact and importance of grades for students and teachers, the history of grading, what we know about why the system is ineffective, and how we should go about changing it, all of which is backed up by a heck ton of research, and I'm not going to link every single study. You can find all those in the works cited of that book that I just dropped on the floor. They're going to mow the lawn right next to my window while I'm filming this video, aren't they? Yes, they are. Well, that's fun. Anyway, you can find all that in the works cited of the book. I'm not editing all of that onto screen. That's going to take me a million years. You can find it yourself. And everything I quote is from that book unless stated otherwise. Yeah, great. Let's get started. So we know that grades matter and have impact. Grades are the main criteria in nearly every decision that schools make about students. Grades inform decisions outside the educational world as well. For example, the fact that I get straight A's means that my car insurance is a good deal cheaper. Some employers will ask for your GPA in order for you to get a job. They declare on some level what college you go to. And obviously, if your grades are terrible, you can't graduate, or you can't move on to the next grade or take the higher level math class. So these numbers kind of on some level control your entire life. And obviously you can make a name outside of these grades and you can be successful without good grades. The amount of high school dropouts that are millionaires is at least more than 2 that I can think of right now. But in general, grades have a lot of impact, and we know this, and we need to be paying attention to the impact our grades have on the lives of students. But why actually does grading exist? Well, that depends on who you ask. Because some teachers grade to show parents how their kids are doing, and others do it to teach the students certain behaviors, and others do it to show students what they know. And there's many reasons that people grade. Nobody grades for the exact same reasons. Teachers thoughtfully and intentionally were creating policies that they believed in their most thoughtful professional judgment would promote learning. Yet they were doing so independently and often contradicting each other, yielding in each school a patchwork of well-intentioned but ultimately idiosyncratic approaches to evaluating and reporting student performance. So before we even get into the fact that the grading system we use is a flaming disaster, we already see that there is an inequity in the discrepancy between individual teachers because everybody is grading different things in ways that they think promote learning. And studies have shown that teachers believe that their grades are accurate signifiers of their students, but also 50% of those teachers believe that their colleagues' grades aren't. So basically they don't trust their other teachers that they work with to grade students properly, so even they know that there's a discrepancy and an inaccuracy in the way that we grade. But the interesting thing is, teachers cite grading as the one sense of autonomy that they have and the most concrete symbol of our authority and expertise. Teachers talked about grading in a language of morals about the real world and beliefs about students. Grading seemed to tap directly into the deepest sense of who teachers were in their classroom. The way that we as teachers grade our students is a big part of our identity as a teacher. It's also how we reward the behaviors that we believe are the best behaviors to have, and that invites a lot of bias, but that's the thing we're gonna talk about later in the video. We're gonna get there. But then at the same time, right, most teacher education programs don't actually teach you how to score or grade things. So our teachers are figuring all of this out on their own, usually based on whatever system was used on them or is used by other teachers in the school that they work in, and then they tweak it as they feel it needs to be tweaked based on their own knowledge. And this is the one sense of core autonomy they have. This is the one thing that the administrators aren't telling them how or what to do. And on top of that, a lot of states have laws protecting teachers' rights to grade, specifically protecting from external pressures to change grades or from being overwritten by somebody. Which means that most school administrators are too afraid to even mention the fact that our grading system is a hot mess, because in many cases it is met with resistance, sometimes even vitriol and formal allegations of attempted infringement upon teachers' academic freedom. Which is obviously not ideal. We don't like that. But at the same time, right, it's perpetuating outdated systems that are actively harming people and enforcing systemic discriminatory structures. So as we dive into this topic, let us all think about the lovely points that are written very nicely on page 13 of Grading for Equity, so I'm not going to try to rewrite them. As we prepare for our journey, let us be ready to suspend what we think we know about grading, teaching, learning, and even students. As we'll learn in chapter 2, we have been brought up in a grading system that is virtually unchanged in over a century and was premised on turn of the 20th century beliefs about the role of schools and who they're for, how to motivate people, and what effective teaching and learning look like. We have been unwitting victims of this system as students and unwitting promoters of the system as teachers and even as caregivers. For many of us, the system works just fine, or at least we believe that it did. But in fact, the traditional system of evaluating students and reporting information about them has been part of the inequities, unfairness, and injustices built into our schools. When this book challenges you, try to put aside your devil's advocate stance, why these practices can't possibly work, and try an angel's advocate stance. Envision the possibilities and potential for teachers and students if we were to grade differently, more fairly, more accurately, and equitably. As radical and revolutionary as some of these ideas might seem, they really aren't. They're based on research, common sense, and most importantly, successful implementation in classrooms. Discussions of grading and the need to change the system is not a direct attack on you as a teacher. They're a discussion of how everything is a mess and we need to change it. And I know that that can be scary. I have been met with a lot of misdirected hatred when I've discussed with teachers the issues with their academic programs and how they were causing me physical harm. And it's very easy to become defensive about these things because it does feel like personal criticism, right? So a reminder that I'm not here saying, nobody is here saying, you individually are a bad teacher and you have messed up and destroyed the lives of tons of children. We are not saying that. That is not productive, that's not fair, and is not true. What we are saying is, hey, you're working within a really flawed system. Here are some recently researched things that help to even the playing field a bit, and I think that implementing them might be really cool because you can change lives positively that way. Very different tone there. So let's take our inner defensiveness that we all have, because we are all human beings, reminded that this feeling is natural, but also it's not helping anybody. And since helping people is our job as teachers, we should probably take that defensiveness and throw it aside. Just for this moment. Because we're just here to learn how we can grade our students based on their actual knowledge and their actual skill set rather than on their environment or situations beyond their control. Because that's how our system currently works and it's hurting everybody, and we want to grade properly because that's what we want as teachers. Cool? Cool. So let's start with the history. The first grading system appeared at Yale in 1785 and it divided students into 4 categories. Optimi, which is best, second optimi, which is second best, inferiores boni, or just inferiores, less good, and peggiores, which is worse. I don't know if I pronounced any of that right. It's Latin. Nobody knows how Latin's pronounced. I pronounced it Italian. I'm sorry. But anyway, I think it's this scale is wildly entertaining because imagine having somebody go, oh, how are your studies going at Yale? And you respond with, well, currently I'm less good, but I'm hoping to make it to second best by the end of term. Because that's hilarious, and I love that. Anyway, this measurement scale might be where the 4-point GPA comes from, probably. That's what scholars think. Who knows, man. Then in 1877, Harvard was like, okay, but like bell curves are really nice. So like what if students were graded on a bell curve and the average student is at a 50 and the highest student's at 100 and the lowest is at a 0? And that's how we got percentage grades. And the incorrect idea that only a certain number of people are allowed to do well in school and everybody else is bad. And then 20 years later in 1897, Mount Holyoke College, aka where I go, I didn't even know about this, went, we want more variance than the Yale thing, but way less than the whole Harvard thing, so we're going to create a letter grading system instead, in which A was 95 to 100 points, B was 85 to 94, C was 76 to 85, D was 75, and E was less than 75. And I would like you to know that I did not know about this grade thing until I stumbled upon this information. I feel like the education department at our school should be more proud of this, or at least it should be mentioned somewhere. But yeah, anyway, in the 1930s, somebody somewhere decided to change the letter E in the grading to a letter F because parents were thinking that E meant excellent and that was bad because it actually meant failing, so they changed it to an F. And before the late 1800s, The United States was organized around rural agricultural economies, and schools served a relatively small role. We saw one-room schoolhouses with teachers who usually had a high school education. Not all the time, sometimes though. And school only happened for about half of the year so that kids could go help out with the harvest on their farms. Grading was pretty much just oral reports to the families of the children as to like how they were doing, or written narratives about various skills that they were studying. But then we have the big world change that I have talked about in depth in not one, not two, but three of my major deep dive videos: the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. What a wonderful time. Also, if you're wondering where this has come up before, my eugenics video, we learned about the vast expansion and creation of eugenics during this time period. My freak show video, we talked about the freak show changing its entire business plan due to increased focus on science and using that to legitimize its own stuff. And then in the capitalism and disability video, we talked about how disability as a social category was created during this time period because disabled people are less efficient in a capitalist society. I did not expect it to come up in this video as well, but now that I have seen how it fits in, I'm not surprised, and it's really cool to see all of my like different disparate research all start to line up and overlap and teach me a lot more about the history of humanity and the world that we live in. Fascinating. But anyway, so in the late 19th to early 20th century, that's like 1880s to 1910s, if century numbers confuse you, me too, babe, science became all the rage, and immigration was increasing. By 1910, 40% of the US population had foreign-born parents. Factories were becoming a thing, so people were moving to cities. Darwin published his book on the theory of evolution, which kicked off social Darwinism and segregation and nativism and eugenics and the need for scientific explanations for literally everything. Also, a lot of imperialism and westward expansion was going on, and the world was just changing a whole ton. And this is also when the first compulsory education laws were put in place, which means that more students were in one spot with the immigration and migration, and then they were also all required to go to school in many of these places. So that meant that new schools needed to be built, and they also needed some sort of system to teach the kids and measure how the kids were doing when they're being taught, because there were just too many kids to do the original method of oral reports and such. So they decided to just take the system used by universities and continue on with that. So that's where our grading system generally came from, but let's look back at the school system, because that's also important here too. How were we going to be creating a new system to educate a bunch of children? What skills do they need to learn to exist in the world? And there were kind of three different things going on, right? So the first was John Dewey. He believed that public education was a democratic equalizer, and he wanted to figure out how to make a system that was equalizing for every single person regardless of background. His ideas got kind of squashed by the second idea. The second idea being one that fueled capitalism. We need our schools to prepare our future employees. So that one won. They set them up to do that. So we got specialization, we got chain of command, we got timed routines, efficiency, compliance, all of those things. And then the third thing going on was behaviorism and IQ tests. People believe that all behavior is the result of external physical stimuli, and therefore you need to use outside reinforcement to teach anything to kids. And then like the IQ test, those were all the rage. They separated kids into different tracks based on those IQs to prepare them for specific roles in economic hierarchy. And if you know anything about the IQ test, tracking students to situate them for specific roles in the economic hierarchy helped to replicate the existing social and racial hierarchy and to provide scientific justification for doing so, which we talked about in the eugenics video. Look, everything's coming full circle. But that's the origin of our school and grading system, based on a bell curve where only a subset of students is capable of meeting standards, and also students can only be motivated through extrinsic reinforcement and consequences, and the key purpose of schools is to sort students for different types of work in the capitalistic industry. And while many elements of the original school system have changed, the grading system has remained virtually unchanged for over 100 years. Which is delightful. So now let's talk about what we know about the grading system, why it definitely needs some zhuzhing up, why we need to change that. I'm sorry I said zhuzhing, now I have to figure out how to spell that for the captions. Man. Anyway, definitely needs a change before we can get into about how to go about doing that. And again, all this stuff supported by a ton of research. We are going to break it up into four ways. I'm a college student. 4 ways. We're gonna break it up into 4 ways that it continues to enforce the achievement gap and structural discrimination, and in general does not promote learning, which is kind of the point of grades and school. So the first reason is that our grading system stifles risk-taking and trust between teacher and student. As we talked about in the trauma-informed practices video from last week or the week before, whenever the heck that was posted, you can watch it up here. We know that successful learning relies on a good teacher-student relationship because being in a position of learning is being in a very vulnerable place. Your teacher knows things that you don't. There's an added power dynamic of they're like in charge of you, and we're trying to put more information into our brains. And if a student feels like their teacher is trustworthy and cares and believes in them, they're gonna feel safe enough to be vulnerable enough to take in new information. And if not, and students make mistakes, which is a natural part of the learning process, that wrongness feels like a very direct attack at a time that we're least able to cope. A school system relying on compliance and extrinsic threats and rewards is not conducive to that kind of learning situation. Students are just going to do what it takes to survive and get by with the least amount of misery, which basically means that they're not going to take risks and they're not going to step out of their comfort zones willingly. The second issue is that our current system sees grades as a commodity. We have this ingrained idea that only some people can get high grades and achievement only matters in comparison to others. That's what's left over from the bell curve idea. So teachers award points for good behavior, they remove points for bad behavior, and they have the power to inject more points in the classroom economy at literally any moment they want to with extra credit or extra assignments. Students become dependent learners, dependent on collecting points, and they're more focused on accumulating those points than on actually learning the material. We also know that our current grading system hides information, it invites biases, and it provides misleading information to the teachers, the parents, and the students. We're going to talk more about what that is and what to do about that in the what to do section. But basically there's two big reasons as to why this happens. The first being implicit bias, in that when we grade behavior, we are grading it through the lens of a teacher's observation of behaviors and how we interpret those behaviors. Which, as a student who needs to be fully involved in a completely different activity in order to pay attention in a class, and therefore I look very rude and disinterested all of the time, if you don't think in your brain as a teacher about how everybody participates differently, that's a big issue because you think that I don't care and that I'm not participating. Not to mention that the fact that certain behaviors a teacher may see as bad are actually core cultural things for historically underserved or oppressed populations, and then you're therefore literally punishing somebody for their cultural environment or their neurotype. Just not cool. The second reason is that our grades are what is known as an omnibus or hodgepodge grade, which is where all the information that we gather about a student, their test scores, their respective classmates, their homework completion, their extra credit, their attendance, all of those things are combined into a final grade. So that means that a student who is really great at looking like they're paying attention and participating in the way that the teacher wants, but also has zero knowledge of the class content that they're supposed to be learning, and another student who has atypical social skills and turns in things late but gets perfect grades whenever they do turn things in, are going to have the same final grade, which completely hides who the student is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and often lands them in the wrong level of further learning where they get more lost and more confused or more frustrated and disinterested because it's all too easy for them. And the last thing that we know about our grading system is that it demotivates and disempowers students. Research has shown that extrinsic motivation, which is like rewards for behaviors to increase those behaviors, only really works for menial or repetitive tasks. For things that involve creative thinking, the goal of modern schools is to teach critical thinking pretty much at this point. Extrinsic motivation is almost entirely ineffective. And to people saying, but my kids are obsessed with how many points they can earn, this is effective, I raise you this very important quote. 5-year-old children don't come into school looking for points, even those who know their numbers, which means that if we believe that our middle school and high school students are motivated extrinsically, it's because we have taught them to be. By rewarding or punishing every single behavior, the students feel like everything that they're doing is being watched and judged, and it causes them to freeze up. They spend more time looking for the right answer than trying and failing. They avoid difficult tasks for fear of failing and believing that they lack the ability and they're not smart when they start to struggle. It also shows them that you don't think that they're going to intrinsically want to learn or turn something in on time or show up to class, and therefore you need to externally reward that behavior, so they're going to keep doing that, which then starts a whole feedback loop of them only doing things until they get the reward and no longer wanting to do them. Because study after study has shown that extrinsic rewards decrease intrinsic motivation. And it also increases the likelihood of students doing the wrong thing, such as cheating or copying just to get a grade. And also, every single teacher has completely different grading policies and different expectations, and it's near impossible to keep all of them straight. Not to mention that, with the omnibus grading system, it's really hard to know what our grade is actually reflecting or how to be successful. So students are going to start to feel like their grade is their identity, and they're defined by their successes and their failures. And all of these things are obviously not what we want to be doing or encouraging or making people feel in our classrooms, because the point of school is learning and learning how to learn and learning how to self-regulate and be confident and think critically and be a human being. And with all of these barriers in the way from a century-old grading system, we're making that really incredibly difficult. So let's talk about what equitable grading is and how we can make changes in our classrooms to fix this issue, or at least make it way less bad. I love how I keep saying we as if I have or intend to run a classroom with a grading policy. Whatever, we're gonna keep saying we. I am a teacher. I was a teacher. Anyway, let's begin with the 3 pillars of equitable grading that this book put forth to kind of reorganize things. So, in order to be equitable, grades need to be accurate, using calculations that are mathematically sound, easy to understand, and correctly describe a student's level of academic performance. bias resistant based on valid evidence of a student's content knowledge and not based on evidence that is likely corrupted by teachers' implicit bias or reflect a student's environment or circumstances, and motivational, capable of motivating students to achieve academic success, support a growth mindset, and give students opportunities for redemption if they mess up. So let's see what these look like in practice. And again, some of these things are probably going to trigger a gut reaction of, oh no, absolutely, that's never going to work. Try to suspend that long enough to listen and at least think about the possibility, okay? Cool, great. So first we have accuracy. We have this idea that the more math we use to calculate a grade, the more accurate and objective that grade must be. That means that we have really weird formulae in grading software and we just kind of trust that those numbers work. And that is simply not the case. Let's start with the zero, particularly assigning zeros for missing work, which is very common. This is pretty typical. Most teachers do it. We see it as normal. But let's take a look at our percentage scale for a minute. As you may remember from our historical breakdown, the percentage appeared at Harvard to do the bell curve thing because they wanted more variance between students because there were just too many students to keep track of in like a 4-category system. But then people realized that nobody knows the difference between a student with an 84 average and an 86 average, and so letter grading became the norm because it made more sense. But then when grading software became a thing, percentage grading came right back and became the norm. And here's the thing with this system. If you get an F, you have failed. We all know this. And the scale is 10 points between each letter grade, A being 90 to 100, B being 80 to 89, C being 70 to 79, D being 60 to 69, and F being 0 to 60. So 60% of our grading scale is failure and 40% is passing. And if you include D in the failing grades, which most teachers do, that's about 70-30. So it's incredibly weighted toward student failure, and that makes it very difficult to recover if you've messed up a handful of times. For example, I was in 7th grade. Most of us have been in 7th grade, but when I was in 7th grade, we had a combination health and PE class where I got straight A's on every assignment. I had like a 98 average in the class. It was gorgeous. And then we had a practicum test for our volleyball unit where you were graded on whether you could serve the volleyball and get it over the net. I did not know that I was disabled at the time. I actively was very disabled. I had no idea. But looking back and knowing that I have some sort of connective tissue disorder and I was growing back then, so my tissues were a disaster, the fact that serving a ball was really, really painful, like with my wrist was really, really painful, was not because I was weak and needed to toughen up, like I was told and thought with myself. It was because my wrists were constantly having micro dislocations. But I couldn't serve the ball over the net, and so I got a 16% on the test. And my grade for that semester dropped from a 98 to an 83, and I was never able to get it back up to an A because I did poorly on just one test. And while a B in health and PE does not really matter to anybody, literally who cares, the same kind of situation can happen to anybody else in any other class and permanently mess up their grade just based on one failed assignment or maybe a few missing homeworks. Which just seems objectively wrong, right? Like, we want the grade to reflect the achievement and knowledge of the student, not that one time they did bad on a thing, but their general achievement and knowledge. And we'll talk more about motivation later, but low grades as motivation to learn more or to work harder to turn in an assignment is also not effective at all whatsoever. And if we're giving somebody a 0 for an assignment simply because it wasn't turned in, that also does not reflect their knowledge of the material because we don't know what they could have gotten had they turned it in. So that's also inaccurate. Many teachers deal with this by marking it as an M and simply canceling the assignment, but a lot of others see that as a sort of free pass for missing assignments, so they don't do that. And instead they choose to force their students to complete the assignment and hold them accountable for the material that they needed to have learned. But then also you don't want to like spend all your time as a teacher hounding down your students to force them to turn everything in, because that's not worth your time or your energy, and also they need to learn to be responsible for their own work. And yes, I have just named every single option you can possibly think of and saying that all of those options are bad ideas. So now what do we do? Great question. Minimum grading. This is setting a bottom threshold that students cannot score below. So like if you got a 38 on a test, your grade would be recorded as a 50 to make sure that if the student puts in the work, they can actually recover their grade and not be punished for that one time that they really messed up. Research has shown that minimum grading better supports learning. It increases motivation because students feel like they aren't permanently destroyed by a single bad grade. They can recover from it if they put in the effort. And it also never inflates grades inaccurately. It really only affects a very small group of students, the ones who intermittently do poorly, and it helps them to not fail. And the students that most typically score like that are the underprivileged and underserved students. So it helps to close the achievement gap a little bit. And if you're worried about the ones who don't try and being like, oh, the ones who don't try are gonna get the same grade as ones who try and fail, that's not fair, you can say that, well, if you don't do something, your minimum grade's a 50, and if you do try something, the minimum's a 55. You have control over your grading system. You can do whatever the heck you want. Another way to avoid the whole, yeah, more than half of our scale's a failure, I guess, situation is to adopt a 0 through 4 scale of grading, where only a fifth of that, the 0, is a failure. This lighting is fascinating. By the way, if you're wondering, updates on my light, they fixed it and it's still broken. So that's great. And I don't feel like putting another work order. Anyway, since there's less variation between grades, it'll also be more accurate and consistent to how students are doing, which sounds new and scary, oh man, but this is also literally what Yale was doing in the 1700s before the percentage scale appeared, so maybe it is probably more effective. The divisions being 0, insufficient evidence, 1, not yet met standards, 2, approaching standards, 3, meeting standards, and 4, exceeding standards. We're gonna get back to this idea in a bit as well. But let us look at how we calculate things for a second. Math is scary, I know, but hear me out. So let's pretend that I have a student whose grades are a 90, an 88, a 100, another 90, and a 0. To find their grade, we're gonna average all of those. So that means adding all those numbers up, that's gonna be 368, and dividing them by the number of scores that we have, which is 5. So that means that their score in the class is about a 74. Which is weird, because they never performed at that level in the class. And if we had a minimum score of 50, their score would be about an 84. That's still not accurate to their performance, but it's a bit better. And you may be thinking, well, isn't that the only way? That's an average. It's the only way to calculate an average grade. So what's the point of this thought exercise? First of all, this is a demonstration of why averaging scores really hurts people who mess up once or twice because they can never truly recover, and why we should be using minimum grading. But more importantly, to tell you that there are other ways, other than the mean, to find the average of a data set that might be more accurate, that are more accurate. So let's try this same set, but use the median instead. The median is the way of averaging a data set to figure out what is in the middle. So if we think back to like 3rd grade, we're gonna line up all those numbers in order, and then we're gonna remove one from each side until we find the middle one. Here, the middle one is 90. That's a lot more accurate to the student's performance. And that removes the weird data from the extremities of the sets, such as the 0 and the 100 in this case. The third way that we can average a data set is the mode. That's the score that is most frequently earned. In this case, that's also a 90 and also pretty accurate. With a 0 to 100 scale, it's pretty dicey to use the mode to average your set for a final grade, but it is super effective on a 0 to 4 scale. But anyway, regardless of how we choose to average it out, if your grades have changed a lot over the course of the semester, you're kind of trapped by how you previously did, which I never really thought about before, but it's true. Like, let's say that Rosie and Fern, they're both sophomores and they're both taking the same advanced geometry class. Rosie took Algebra 2 last year because she's been going to the school for a few years, and she took Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And Fern, she's new to the school, so she took Algebra 1 last year at her public school, and she did really well. So when she came here, they decided, we're just gonna put you into advanced geometry. Now, on the first few tests, Fern does really badly because she never learned some of the foundational skills in Algebra 1 at her old school. She works really, really hard with the teacher, and by the end of the semester, she's caught up and she's learned everything, and she's getting 100s on everything. Rosie, who already had that foundation because she'd been going to the school and had the advanced class beforehand, already knew that content, and she was getting 100s and everything from the beginning. But then at the end of the semester, while they're both at the same knowledge level, Fern's grade is going to be significantly lower than Rosie's simply because she didn't have the prior knowledge to let her succeed from day one. That's not Fern's fault. It's not her fault that it took her longer to learn the information than Rosie. She didn't get the head start that Rosie got. So equity-wise, that's not great. And her final grade isn't accurately measuring her knowledge at her current level of performance, which is also not fair to her because we should be recognizing how great she's doing. So now, when I read this section of the book, I was like, oh, that does make sense. And then it talked about why we should, instead of averaging all the grades people get over the course of a period of time, just grade people based on how they most recently did. And my brain immediately went, oh my gosh, no, that doesn't work, we can't do that. But then the more I thought about it, my man Joe has a point, because elementary schools almost universally grade students like this. If you were not meeting expectations during the 3rd quarter, but then you were exceeding expectations in the 4th quarter, your grade is not kind of sort of meeting expectations, your grade is exceeding expectations, because that's where you landed, and it's kept that way. So why can't we do that for everybody else? It doesn't mean that we're deleting all their previous grades or information about how they did, it just means that we're not punishing the students who didn't have the prior knowledge coming into the class, and therefore our grades are going to be more equitable at the end of the day. Everybody who's met educational standards by the end of the year, regardless of how long it takes them to get there, should have their grade reflect that. They deserve that. That's the fair thing to do. Now, what if they slack off at the beginning of the semester because only the later grades matter? Well, studies have shown that students in classes using this model usually try harder at the beginning than the traditional method because they feel like they can continue to improve and they want to try. So there's that. Another way to ensure accuracy is when doing group work, grade the individual's achievements rather than the group's achievements. When you give the entire group the same grade, kids who are struggling get inflated grades, and also they don't learn the content because typically they freeze up, and then the kids who are doing really well in the class are just gonna be like, oh, and then they'll do the entire project. And so nobody's gonna learn anything, and everybody's gonna hate each other, and it's gonna be universal resentment in the classroom, and then you have to do class therapy. None of that's cute. And this also hurts students with atypical social skills who communicate things differently. So it's bad. And as much as I hate group work, It is an important thing. That hurts to say, but it is. It's important. You can do it in a not terrible way. You can grade the individuals on the content learned, and you can tell them beforehand the purpose here is for all of you to learn the content in a different way, but also you're going to be responsible for it individually at the end of the activity. So they can then get the correct grade for their skill level. And you can also help facilitate the groups a bit by having them start their meeting by talking through boundaries about what people do and don't want from their group, so that it's easier for people to speak up for their needs rather than just all jumping into the work and having somebody afraid to stand up for themselves. So that's pillar 1. That's accuracy. Moving on. Pillar 2. That is bias resistance, aka making the grades objective. And one thing that we often see in this category is teachers being like, well, this underserved kid tried really, really, really hard, and I'm gonna bump their grade a bit to make it more equitable because the world is against them. And while that feels like the right thing to do, it is depriving the kid of a huge part of equity, which is honesty and dignity. Not to mention that their grade is not reflecting the knowledge that they have, so it'll probably cause more issues for them down the line. But that's where bias comes in, specifically when we're grading behavior rather than academic success. Because if we grade students based on participation and effort, those things are going to look wildly different for everybody. We talked about this in my Crip Time video. And not only do these things look different, but we also don't see how much time and effort somebody is putting into the work when they're not at school. We only see what they're doing in our classroom. By grading participation and effort, we're grading them on appearing like they are learning in the prescribed ways that we expect learning to look like, which usually hurts your minority kids because our ideals of what learning looks like are very neurotypical and very able-bodied, and also usually the same behaviors that people of color refer to as acting white. So they're punished in their communities, so they don't want to do those in the classroom. Rewarding what we view as effort and participation is in fact just rewarding compliance and focusing more on behavior than on the outcome that we want from the behavior, which is learning. So those grades can go right out the window. Goodbye behavior, we don't want to see it. Another thing that can definitely go out the window is extra credit. First of all, extra credit assignments continue to perpetuate the whole grades are commodity, we must try to accumulate points situation, which is not measuring a student's knowledge, and that's not cute. It also creates a sort of choose your own adventure thing, where you can look at the class and you can choose to skip out on some things and supplant them with unrelated things to still get the grade that you want. And most importantly, higher achieving students are usually the ones who make use of the extra credit, which simply widens the achievement gap, because students who are academically struggling are not going to try the extra challenges. They're not going to want to do that. Not to mention that many extra credit tasks involve going to an event, which means you have to have time to spare, have transportation, have somebody to take you, be able to afford the event, have that event be safe and accessible for you, etc., etc. A lot of extra credit that we see here at Mount Holyoke in the psych department is participating in other students' studies. And they're a lot tamer now simply because most studies that are happening right now are just like online surveys. But as a disabled person, I could not safely take part in many of the studies because of the sensory components that they required, which means that I didn't get those extra 5 points that could have bumped up my grade, which was basically punishing me for my disability, which is kind of illegal. So don't love that. Now, another important behavioral thing is to grade the work, not the timing of the work. It's really common for students to lose points for late work, and that's not fair to students who may not have time to do all of their homework because they're helping to care for their little siblings, or the one with memory loss who genuinely forgot it existed until right now, or the one who didn't get home from practice until 9 o'clock last night and were too tired to complete it. And not only are these situations really common, but they encourage cheating because students would rather just get the points and not learn than lose points and learn the material. Research has shown that when you stop penalizing for late work, you actually get more completed work, increased quality of work, and increased learning. Many teachers will give space for assignments to be due anytime between like now and the end of the unit so that students can get things done as they need to, but also not bombard you with every single assignment from the whole year at the exact same time because you don't want to have to grade that. But the other most common behavioral thing that we see in classrooms is grading consequences for cheating. If we catch a student cheating, you get a 0 in the assignment. All this really does is punish their behavior by giving them a grade that they cannot recover from, if we remember the whole no zeros thing from earlier, and you're also not actually holding them accountable for the material that they needed to learn. It's really common for us to think of cheaters as bad students who don't care and they're trying to disrespect you. But if we look at that, like in reality, nearly every single student has cheated at some point in their lives. It happens because a student doesn't believe that they can be successful on their own, whether that's because they couldn't learn the content fast enough, they didn't have time, they missed some assignments, they didn't want to study, they couldn't make themselves focus to study, any and all of these reasons. It's very rarely a malicious, I hate you so I'm gonna cheat on this test thing. So rather than, ruining their lives with a 0, studies have found that rehabilitative and restorative justice measures are way more effective. So that would be punishing cheating by making them do service in the classroom, or write a paper on the consequences of cheating, and take the next few exams with supervision to help them to rebuild trust. Now, the last thing in this category is not grading homework and only getting grades from summative assignments, which are tests and quizzes and exams. And I know, but hear me out. Homework helps students to practice what they learned in class, and it gives the teacher valuable insight into their students' understanding. It's a way for the students to learn and make mistakes, and a way for the teachers to check in to see how the students are doing. So grading homework for correctness makes no sense. It is completely counterintuitive to the learning process, because if you're like, hey, we want you to make mistakes, that's how you learn, and then we're punishing them for making mistakes, that makes no sense. And I think that at this point, the majority of teachers know that. I have not had people grade correctness on homework for a long time. And that's why typically we grade on completion or an attempt, where students only lose points for blank answers or for not doing the assignment. But this also still hurts students. It inflates scores for weaker students who will not know the material. And it also hurts the demographic of students that I mentioned earlier who may turn in late work or not have a chance to finish their work. And also for those with higher levels of stress and higher cognitive load. For example, the student could be undocumented and there's a constant looming anxiety of deportation, or their mom is in the hospital and so they're constantly thinking about that. It's harder for them to focus and actually do the assignment, so they're just going to freeze up and not start it at all, which means that their grade is punishing them for their circumstances. Not to mention that this method makes kids do the work only to please the teacher, not to learn from it. And for the situations I just mentioned, the extrinsic motivation of grades is not going to make them suddenly able to get their work done. It's just gonna punish them. Like they have legitimate reasons for struggling to get their work done. And obviously this whole situation still encourages copying and cheating. So let's look at homework another way. If it just exists as a thing, and you teach your students why it needs to exist, why practice matters, and why it helps them to learn, they're actually a lot more likely to do it. And they learn to take responsibility for their own learning, to self-assess their own understanding, and understand the benefits of doing the work. This also prevents double punishing, which is them getting a bad grade for missing an assignment and then getting a second bad grade on the test because they didn't learn the material that was on the assignment. It allows space for different learning styles. For example, if this assignment is not how you learn, you can learn a different way with no punishment for having to spend your time doing something that is not effective for you. Teachers can reallocate their time to other things. And when students get feedback on their work, they actually read it, because studies have shown that if students get a grade on something, they don't even look at the feedback written in it because the grade feels like a done deal and they don't want to go back and learn from it because it's just a grade. So this is a major win all around. Now, what about your grade book, you're asking? You can keep track of all these assignments. In fact, you probably should, because at the end of the day, like if the student fails the test, you can point to the fact they didn't do any of the previous assignments to help them understand that their behaviors do have consequences. But if you weigh those assignments as 0% of their grade, they actually get the chance to learn from those mistakes rather than just being perpetually screwed. Now, by not grading homework or behavior, we're left solely grading summative assessments, which seems scary and absurd, right? But honestly, it does make a lot of sense if you think about it. Do we calculate an Olympian score as the average between the 2 practice runs they did right before the race and the actual race? No, we just count the race because that's the final product. So why shouldn't school be the exact same way? I mean, obviously this does feel a little new and a little scary and a little frightening to boil your grade down to just a few things a year. But honestly, it's a lot more effective as a tool of motivation and as a measure of their knowledge. You can also use this time to make several different options of assessments, because whether they can perform on a certain test should be assessed very differently from whether they know the content or not. I've personally have had a few professors here who've left the assessment pretty much open to how we want to show that we know the material. So sometimes I've written papers, recorded audio essays, I've made YouTube videos, I've written songs, and it's how I actually engage in the content in a fun, new, and interesting way and show in my own way what I've learned. And I really, really enjoy exams like that. So now let's look at the last pillar, motivation. We want our grades to make our students actually want to learn. That's supposed to be the point of them. We are far past that at this point, but that is the goal of them existing. So let's start with what we know scientifically. We know that tangible short-term rewards screw up long-term motivation because they're focused on the immediate goal, the immediate reward, rather than being creative and flexible and free to think originally. It increases unethical behavior as a means to an end, like copying and cheating, and people typically work until they get the reward and then stop and go no further. For example, if you asked me to draw you a picture for a payment of a lollipop, I'd do it, but I'd be much less likely to draw a picture just for fun later because last time I got rewarded, so now it's not as fun and I don't really care anymore. We've seen that with our grading system. Students aren't learning or thinking critically, they're just trying to accumulate points and get good grades, which makes sense. That's the society that we've created. And for students who don't do well, rather than motivating them to try harder and do better, low grades typically make the student give up and completely kills any confidence that they previously had, because we have a tendency to see grades as very solid and very transactional, and they define a person rather than temporary things that grow and change with a student as they learn and grow. There's not much movement or growth mindset going on with this grading system that we currently have, and those things are the things that trigger intrinsic motivation and interest to want to keep going and to want to make mistakes and to want to be vulnerable and to learn. So first thing in this section, let's talk about retakes and redos. People typically do poorly on tests because of an interfering situation impeding them from performing their best. The format or design of the assessment impeding them from communicating their knowledge. I don't test well. that's my issue, but it's not because I'm stupid, it's just because I don't test well. Inadequate preparation or weak understanding of the concepts. And these are usually things that can change over time. So rather than say, yeah, we're not grading homework anymore, so the only grades that you get are the ones on your tests, but also if you do a bad job on your test, you're really screwed, we're saying, hey, tests are supposed to be a capstone to show me what you've learned. And if you find afterwards that you didn't do too great and you still have more things to learn, you have the chance to go back and learn that and then try again and have a stronger foundation moving on from here because all content builds on each other. Retakes have been shown to significantly decrease test anxiety the first time around, increase performance the first time around, and also the numbers of students who need retakes over time goes down because they learn to study and they have a better foundation for the rest of the material. It also allows teachers to panic less about their assessments, so they make better and clearer assessments the first time around. So overall, retakes and redos help everybody. Now, the next section of the book about retakes and redos was kind of a traditional FAQ setup, so we're going to just go through that rapid fire. If you want to learn more in depth about how to do this, you can read the book. It's a great book and you should read it no matter what. So, yes, every student, regardless of score, should be able to do a retake because every student deserves the learning opportunity. And also, like, if somebody got a higher score in their retake than another student got the first time around who wasn't allowed to retake, that's just not fair. There should not be a grade ceiling on retakes, aka like you can't score higher than this one grade because that punishes students who learn more slowly. Also, sometimes students do score lower the second time around. I've personally done that on a retake. That's very rare. Pick the most accurate score for the student's knowledge. All students should be allowed to retake anything as long as they will learn from it, and they don't need to retake the whole thing, just the stuff that they have yet to learn. Some students are only able to learn a portion of content at once and genuinely need to work in smaller chunks, so retakes actually make grading more equitable to that. It can also be the same assessment or a different assessment, whatever you want, whichever you think is going to most accurately assess the student's understanding. Between the original assessment and the retake, the teacher should find the gaps in the student's knowledge and learning to help them to fill them. That could mean requiring them to complete or redo work on these topics or showing that they've studied in another way. You can also make the process of finding those gaps in knowledge way easier for yourself by organizing your tests by concept rather than by question type. That also helps students to remember the material because that's how brains work. Also, will you be stuck in Unit 1 forever? Maybe, but you can limit how many retakes a student is allowed or what time frame that those retakes are allowed in, but also if a student is working for that long and still genuinely wants to learn, who are we to stop their learning? That seems kind of bad. I don't know. Just not good. Retakes are only equitable when they're mandatory. Typically, struggling students won't believe that they're capable of learning the information, so they're not going to try. And also for every student who discloses a struggle and is willing to try again, there are a bunch of others who don't disclose something and are just too scared to do that. So if you force everybody to do it, then it's effective, it's equitable. And then you can also work it into the schedule in a way that makes it easy for them and not feel like too much extra work and require that they succeed. Because if you require them to succeed, they will. And in regards to the but you don't get do-overs in the real world argument, that is blatantly not true. You can take the SAT as many times as you want. You can take the driver's test as many times as you want. You can ask for a second chance if you mess up in life. You just need to learn how to put in the additional work, how to ask for those second chances, and how to believe that you can do the thing. Also, the whole idea of like school needs to prepare you for the real world as if these students aren't already currently living in the real world and living real lives with real expectations, and also that expectations are different for every person based on a large number of reasons, and also the world is changing a ton, so the standards that you hold to them to right now could be completely obsolete by the time they get to the real world. Is annoying. It's wrong, incorrect. No, don't do that. And also, speaking of the real world, the complexity of a school's formal and informal rules advantages students and families that our schools were originally built to serve. Those with higher education backgrounds, native English speakers, and the well-to-do. And was that transition bad? Yes, it was, but I tried. We're almost at the end of this video. We're almost there. Whew. Part of equity is making sure that all students and caregivers have equal information, access, and opportunity to navigate systems and structures. Because students who know what an office hour is are probably going to have a leg up over those who don't. And since education is built on trust, ambiguity, not being super clear in expectations, and also in grading systems, we're going to get there in a second, that's where this is going, these cause students to not trust their educators and to not feel safe enough to be vulnerable and to therefore learn. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is transparency of expectations. Rubrics are your very best friend. Break down a list of the different things that you want your students to achieve and how those achievements can earn them certain grades, and they'll know what to do. Many teachers also overall will grade on a standard scale where they list the standards they expect from their students at the end of a unit. For example, like by the end of this unit, you will be able to multiply 2-digit numbers on your own, and then use the 0 to 4 scale that we talked about earlier of whether they've met or are exceeding standards to measure where they're at throughout the unit and at the end of the unit. And then when you grade things at the end, rather than you got this grade in your assessment, you're instead averaging what standards you met, and you get to see that breakdown, which is a very clear explanation to the student and the family and the next teacher of what they need to work on and what they've got covered. It helps them to see their grades not as intrinsic to who they are, but rather a direct measure of their skill set, and they learn how to see an expectation and how to meet that expectation, just like they're gonna have to in the so-called real world that we just complained about earlier. And I wish that I'd been graded this way for a lot of my life, because boy, would it have actually taught me what I needed to learn and what I didn't need to stress about. This video ended up being vaguely horrifically long. Sorry about that. But I wanted to make sure I got in at least like half to 3/4 of the things that I learned. I found myself through this process getting increasingly mad at the school system, and just getting a stronger and stronger desire to just, I don't know, throw this textbook at some of my professors and then run in the other direction and never return to school. But I'm not gonna do that. The thought is, it's crossed my mind, but we're not going to do that. Reminder that this video is a lot of things, right? Not all of them are conducive to each other, and just take small bites, adjust your classroom every little bit, adjust your grading every little bit, slowly in ways that feel most natural to you and also serve your students in the best way that they can. You're taking a leap of faith, but it's a leap of faith into research that already exists. So it's not super scary, but it's a little scary, and I acknowledge that. If you want to learn more about equitable grading, you can check out Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. I highly, highly recommend it. If you want to learn more about trauma-informed practices and creating an accessible classroom, I have a playlist up here and also in the description for you. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.